Most people quit saving at this number. You know that moment when you finally get your savings account to a number that feels comfortable? Like, not rich, not financially independent, but just enough that you stop checking your balance every other day? Maybe it's $5,000. Maybe it's 10. For some people, it's 25,000. And they hit that number and something weird happens. They just stop. Not intentionally, not because they made some conscious decision to quit saving, but because psychologically, emotionally, something shifts. They start spending a little more freely. They stop automatically transferring money every paycheck. They tell themselves they'll get back to it, but weeks turn into months and that number just sits there, maybe shrinking a little, maybe staying roughly the same, but definitely not growing anymore. And here's the really strange part. It happens to almost everyone at some specific number. Not the same number for everyone, obviously, but there's this invisible threshold where the brain just goes, okay, we're good now, and the discipline evaporates. My name is Ryan, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, behavioral psychology, and why people make the financial decisions they do, especially the ones that don't make logical sense. And this phenomenon, this savings plateau that nobody really talks about, it's one of the most fascinating and frustrating patterns I've ever studied. Because what if I told you that the number where you quit saving isn't random, that it's actually revealing something really important about how you think about money, security, and your own future? And what if understanding why you stop at that particular number could completely change your entire financial trajectory? Not in some get-rich-quick way, but in a fundamental, oh wow, I've been thinking about this all wrong kind of way. That's what we're going to dig into here. Not just the psychology behind why we quit saving, but what that number means, why it feels like enough even when rationally we know it isn't, and most importantly, how to push past it without feeling like you're depriving yourself or living some joyless penny-pinching existence. The comfort threshold is real, and it's sabotaging you. So let's start with the basics. There's actual research on this, and it's kind of wild. Behavioral economists have found that most people have what they call a comfort threshold, basically a number in their savings account that makes them feel safe enough to relax. And once they hit that number, their saving behavior changes dramatically. For a lot of people, especially living paycheck to paycheck or just starting to build savings, that number is somewhere between $3,000 and $6,000. It's not enough to retire on, obviously. It's not even enough to cover most major emergencies, if we're being honest, but it's enough to feel like a cushion. Enough that if your car breaks down, you're not completely screwed. Enough that you're not one unexpected bill away from complete financial chaos. And your brain really, really likes that feeling. Because here's the thing about human psychology. We're not wired to optimize for the future. We're wired to avoid immediate danger and seek immediate comfort. So when you've spent months or years feeling financially anxious, barely scraping by, stressed about every purchase, and then suddenly you have a few $1,000s sitting there, it's like your nervous system exhales for the first time in forever. That relief is powerful. Like physiologically powerful. Your cortisol levels drop. You sleep better. You stop having those 3 a.m. panic attacks about money. And your brain goes, perfect, we solved it. We're safe now. Let's stop doing the uncomfortable thing that got us here. Except you didn't solve it. You just reached the first checkpoint. I remember when I first hit $5,000 in savings. I was in my mid-20s, and honestly, I felt wealthy. I know that sounds absurd now, but at the time, I'd never had that much money in one place. I'd grown up in a household where money was always tight, where my parents fought about bills, where financial anxiety was just the baseline emotional state. So having $5,000 felt like I'd made it, like I'd achieved something real. And you know what I did? I stopped saving. Not completely, but my intensity dropped off a cliff. I started saying yes to more dinners out. I upgraded my phone when I didn't really need to. I convinced myself I deserved a nicer apartment. And my savings just sat there at around $5,000 for almost 2 years. Sometimes it dipped to 4, sometimes it crept up to 6, but it basically flatlined.
Looking back, I can see exactly what happened. That $5,000 mark had become my new zero. Psychologically, anything above that felt like extra money that I could spend. Anything below it triggered anxiety and forced me to tighten up again. I'd created this artificial ceiling without even realizing it. And this is what happens to most people. The number varies. For some it's 3,000, for others it's 10,000 or even 50,000, but the pattern is identical. You hit your comfort threshold, your behavior changes, and you plateau. Why your brain thinks enough when it isn't. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The number where you stop saving isn't random. It's actually revealing something really important about how you think about money, security, and your own future. And what if understanding why you stop at that particular number could completely change your entire financial trajectory? Not in some get-rich-quick way, but in a fundamental, oh wow, I've been thinking about this all wrong kind of way. That's what we're going to dig into here. Not just the psychology behind why we quit saving, but what that number means, why it feels like enough even when rationally we know it isn't, and most importantly, how to push past it without feeling like you're depriving yourself or living some joyless penny-pinching existence. The comfort threshold is real, and it's sabotaging you. So let's start with the basics. There's actual research on this, and
It's deeply connected to your personal history with money and your concept of what financial security looks like. If you grew up poor, your comfort threshold might be surprisingly low, because when you've experienced real scarcity, when you've seen bank accounts with negative balances, or watched your parents choose between groceries and electricity, having even a few $1,000s feels like abundance. Your frame of reference is skewed by your past, so your definition of enough is calibrated to a survival mindset, not a thriving mindset. On the flip side, if you grew up wealthy or upper middle class, your comfort threshold might be much higher, but it's still there. Maybe it's $100,000, maybe it's $500,000, but there's still some number where you unconsciously decide this is fine and stop pushing. And here's the really sneaky part. That number is almost always connected to the largest financial shock you can imagine experiencing. It's not based on your actual financial goals or what you'd need for retirement or true financial independence. It's based on the worst-case scenario your brain can vividly picture. So if the worst thing you can imagine is your car breaking down and needing a $5,000 repair, guess where you'll probably stop saving? Right around $5,000, because subconsciously you've prepared for your worst-case scenario and your brain declares victory. But life doesn't work that way. The worst-case scenario isn't your car breaking down, it's job loss, it's medical emergencies, it's your entire industry collapsing. It's the kind of stuff that requires 6 months of expenses saved up, or a year or more. But because those scenarios are too big and scary and abstract, your brain doesn't emotionally prepare for them. It prepares for the immediate, concrete threats it can picture. This is why financial advisors always talk about having 3 to 6 months of expenses saved as an emergency fund. Not because that number is magic, but because it's forcing you to think beyond the immediate small-scale disasters and prepare for the actually catastrophic ones. But even knowing this intellectually doesn't always help, because the comfort threshold isn't a logical thing. It's emotional, it's visceral, it's your nervous system telling you we can relax now, and your discipline crumbling as a result. The lifestyle creep nobody warns you about. So you hit your comfort threshold, you stop saving as aggressively, and then something else happens, something insidious. Your spending starts to creep up. Not dramatically, not in a way that sets off alarm bells, just gradually. You start ordering delivery more often instead of cooking. You upgrade from the basic streaming service to the premium one. You buy the nicer brand at the grocery store. You stop checking prices as carefully. You say yes to more social invitations that cost money. Individually, none of these decisions feel significant. You're not buying a yacht, you're just living a little more comfortably. And honestly, you've earned it, right? You saved up that cushion, you hit your goal, you deserve to enjoy life a little. And that's the trap, because what you're actually doing is allowing your baseline lifestyle to inflate to match your income. This is what financial people call lifestyle creep, and it's one of the biggest wealth killers out there. Here's how it works in practice.
Let's say you were saving $500 a month when you were aggressively building up your savings. Then you hit your comfort threshold and you decide you don't need to save quite as much anymore, so you drop down to saving $200 a month. That frees up $300. Now you don't immediately spend all $300 on one thing. That would feel reckless. Instead, you spread it across a bunch of small upgrades, an extra $50 on groceries because you're buying higher quality food, an extra $100 on entertainment and dining out, an extra $75 on subscription services and small conveniences, and maybe you even put $75 toward paying off debt a little faster, which feels responsible. But here's what happened. You fundamentally changed your lifestyle. Those aren't one-time purchases. They're recurring expenses. They're new habits. And now, 6 months later, that level of spending feels normal. It feels like your baseline. So even if you wanted to ramp your savings back up, it would require cutting things that now feel essential, not extra. I did this exact thing when I stopped saving aggressively. I didn't go crazy. I didn't buy a new car or take an expensive vacation. I just started spending $40 a week on takeout instead of $20. I signed up for a few more streaming services. I bought nicer clothes. I went to more concerts and events. And within a year, my monthly expenses had increased by about $400, completely eating up the money I'd been saving. The worst part, I didn't even feel like I was living better. The upgrades were so incremental that I adapted to them immediately. The nicer food became normal food. The extra entertainment became baseline entertainment. I'd raised my standard of living without raising my happiness, and in the process, I'd sabotaged my long-term financial progress. The false summit problem. You know what this reminds me of? Mountain climbing. There's this phenomenon called a false summit, where you're hiking up a mountain and you see what looks like the peak. You push towards it, exhausted, telling yourself, just make it to the top and we can rest. And then you get there and realize it's not the actual summit, it's just a high point. The real peak is still hours away, hidden behind this false one. That's exactly what the comfort threshold is. It's a false summit. You think you've reached financial security, but you've really just reached the first visible milestone. And because you can't see the actual summit from where you are, true financial independence, retirement savings, generational wealth, whatever your real goal is, you convince yourself that this false summit is good enough. And I get it, the real summit is far away. The real summit requires years or decades of sustained effort. The real summit might require you to save hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, which feels impossible from where you're standing. So you settle for the false summit because at least it's something, at least you made it this far. But here's the thing about false summits. They're comfortable in a really dangerous way. You can set up camp there. You can convince yourself you've accomplished something real, but you haven't actually reached the destination. And the longer you stay comfortable on that false summit, the harder it becomes to push toward the actual peak. I'm not saying you should never rest or enjoy your progress. That would be miserable and unsustainable. But there's a difference between a strategic rest and giving up because you've hit a comfortable spot. The question you have to ask yourself is, what's my actual summit? What's the real destination? Is it just having a small emergency fund, or is it genuine financial independence? Is it just not living paycheck to paycheck, or is it building wealth that can support your dreams and protect your family? Because if you're honest with yourself, that comfort threshold number probably isn't your real goal. It's just the first place where your brain feels safe enough to stop climbing.
Breaking through requires identity change, not just discipline. So how do you actually push past this? How do you keep saving even after you hit that comfortable number? The conventional advice is usually about discipline and willpower. Set up automatic transfers, track your spending, create a budget. And sure, those things help. They're tools, but they're not the real solution. Because here's what I've learned. You can't willpower your way past a comfort threshold in the long term. You'll white-knuckle it for a few months, maybe even a year, but eventually you'll slip back. The only way to truly break through is to change how you see yourself and what you believe about money. This sounds abstract, I know, but stick with me. When you're saving up to that initial comfort threshold, you're operating from a scarcity identity. You're the person who doesn't have enough, who's building towards safety, who's trying to escape financial anxiety. And that identity is powerful. It drives behavior. It makes you disciplined because the alternative, staying in scarcity, is unacceptable. But once you hit that comfort threshold, you unconsciously shift identities. You become the person who has savings. You're no longer scared, so that fear-driven motivation disappears, and without a new identity to replace it, you just drift. The breakthrough happens when you consciously adopt a new identity. Not the person who has savings, but the person who builds wealth. Not the person who escaped poverty, but the person who creates financial freedom. Not the person who has an emergency fund, but the person who invests in their future. This might sound like semantics, but it's not. Your identity determines your behavior. If you see yourself as someone who builds wealth, then saving isn't a temporary project, it's just what you do. It's part of who you are. If you see yourself as someone who creates financial freedom, then every dollar saved isn't a sacrifice, it's an investment in your future self. I didn't break through my own plateau until I made this shift. I stopped thinking of myself as Ryan who has some savings and started thinking of myself as Ryan who builds wealth. And that one mental shift changed everything. Suddenly, keeping my savings at $5,000 felt inconsistent with my identity. It felt like I was lying to myself about who I was. So I started saving again, not because I forced myself, but because that's what wealth builders do. And because my identity had shifted, the discipline came naturally. It wasn't painful, it was just obvious. The practical path forward. Okay, so let's get practical. Identity shifts are great, but you also need concrete strategies to push past your comfort threshold without making yourself miserable. First, you need to redefine what enough means. Instead of enough to feel safe, it needs to become enough to be free. And freedom has a specific number. It's usually somewhere between 6 months and 2 years of living expenses, depending on your risk tolerance and career stability. Calculate that number, write it down, make it real. Because vague goals don't motivate behavior, specific numbers do. Second, automate the hell out of your savings. I know everyone says this, but seriously, if you have to make a conscious decision to save every month, you will eventually stop. Set up automatic transfers the day after you get paid. Make it so that saving is the default and spending requires effort, not the other way around. Third, create what I call growth milestones instead of just one big goal. If your ultimate target is $50,000, that feels impossibly far away from $5,000. But if you break it into milestones, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, each one becomes achievable. And hitting each milestone gives you that little dopamine hit that keeps you motivated without letting you plateau. And fourth, increase your savings rate with your income. This is crucial. Every time you get a raise, promotion, or bonus, immediately increase your automatic savings by at least half of that increase. Don't let your lifestyle inflate to match your new income. Let your savings inflate instead. And fifth, visualize your future self. This sounds cheesy, but it works. Studies show that people who can vividly imagine their future selves make better long-term decisions. So spend some time actually thinking about who. Seeing my current spending decisions as gifts or burdens to my future self. That expensive dinner? I wasn't just spending money, I was taking it away from future Ryan who might need it for something more meaningful. That decision to save an extra $100? I was giving future Ryan more options, more freedom, more security. It made the sacrifices feel less like deprivation and more like love, like I was taking care of someone I cared about.